First of all, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure to be here today. It's a privilege for me at any time to talk to people who are engaged in helping others learn. I consider to be the teaching profession one of the most valuable and sometimes less valued professions in our society. But I think that anybody who is got the ability to help somebody else learn is tremendously influential. And I'll be referring to you, as you'll understand as I go through the session this morning, I'll be referring to you all as learning practitioners. I was a general practitioner for a number of years, and I view all people involved in education, such as you are, as learning practitioners. And I hope that what I'm sharing this morning will go some way towards enthusing you and boosting your own self of value in what you're doing, and also equip you in your work of being a learning practitioner. I'd like to thank you for the hospitality last night, for both a nice bed and also a lovely meal and lovely company as well. I'm also very interested, I don't know much about the Open University, but I'm very, very interested in what you're doing and in finding out more. And this has been a learning experience for me even since I arrived, because I have a conviction that everyone can learn. And one particular group of people who I'm very interested in are people who are approaching retirement and in their later years. And the fact that our brains, and I'll refer to this later, our brains can keep developing up to any age. And one of the most important things in trying to cut statistics in both depression and dementia and social isolation is if we can get people in their 50s and 60s and onwards realizing that if they will keep learning, their brains will keep developing. It's not enough just to keep doing what you always did. If you always did crosswords, keep doing crosswords or something like that. It's the new learning that stimulates growth in the brain, as I'll try to illustrate this morning. And there's a tremendous opportunity here for people to tap into the resources of the Open University, which is such a flexible way of delivering learning that could actually transform the experience of so many people in their retirement years. So this is exciting for me. It's been a learning experience for me, John, to be here, and I'm hoping to learn more as a result of this visit about the tremendous work that's going on. Well, as she said, I'm John Kelly. I'm a medical doctor, and through a rather circuitous route, I found myself involved in education at a time when there was a growing increase in understanding how the brain and education come together. And that was a sort of natural association for me. And about 9 years ago, I set up Fingerprint Learning. And as you see, the theme of that was really how each person learns in unique ways, and that applies to everybody. So it was unique learning for all. And the phrase fingerprint's quite interesting. It gets sometimes mispronounced. It's been called footprint learning or fingertip learning. And as Nicola was saying, I've been working in Hyde Bank Young Offender Centre that has now become Hyde Bank Wood College. Every inmate has now become a student, and they're on a full-time education program. And that's quite a challenge to move from being a prison to being a college. And I was training staff last week and trying to help them understand the transition. And they thought they were coming to fingerprint classes to learn about fingerprinting. So I was sorry to disappoint them. This is a quotation by a man who won the Nobel Prize in 1981, and it has really impressed me. The individuality inherent in our brain networks makes that of fingerprints or facial features gross and simple by comparison. I'll just leave that up for a moment to think about that. That's a very, very powerful statement about the unique wiring of each of our brains in this room. And I like to refer to what I'm talking about this morning as whole brain learning. I've just published a book, literally last weekend. You'll see it amongst the reading list at the end of your outline there, on whole brain learning, in an attempt to try and make it accessible to all kinds of learning practitioners. And I'll touch on that again in a wee while. So the theme really this morning is whole brain learning and teaching, but I've entitled it, because I thought that might put you off when you read it in the brochure, I've entitled it Discovering the Grain of Your Brain, which is really what this morning's about. Why does the brain matter for teachers? Why is the brain important in teaching? If you went to a physiotherapist, and many of you probably have been to a physiotherapist, and you said, how long did you train for? And they said, well, I trained for 4 years. And you said, well, in the 4 years, how many lectures did you have on bones and joints and muscles and nerves? And they said, well, I didn't have any, actually. I just learned to be a physiotherapist. You probably wouldn't go back again. If you say to teachers, and I've trained hundreds of teachers in Northern Ireland in the last number of years, and you say, well, how long did you train for? 4 years. Well, in those 4 years, how many lectures did you have on the organ that you are dealing with? And which organ do you think that teachers primarily engage with? Yes. How many lectures did you have on the brain in 4 years? Do you know what the answer almost always is? None. Unless that's early years or special needs. Now, I find that that's actually extraordinary. We wouldn't accept it in a physiotherapist, and yet we accept it in the teaching profession, where probably the role of the brain in learning calls not just for a lecture or two, it probably calls for whole modules, because this is the organ that we're working in. And I liken this a wee bit to the story of the king's new clothes. I'm sure you're familiar with the story about how these tailors managed to persuade him that they had this wonderful invisible thread that was extremely expensive, and they can do him these wonderful robes. And of course they pretended to do it, and he's riding down the town, and he's actually not wearing anything, but everybody's bought into it, and they're all cheering and shouting at how wonderful he looks. And the little boy says, but he's not wearing any clothes. And I liken this area to that story. How can it be possible that in 4 years of teacher education, or in a PGCE, someone who's going to go out and work with the organ of learning every day is not taught about that organ of learning? And I know that more has been done in education in the last number of years on learning styles and that kind of thing. But to teach people about learning styles and not to teach them about the brain, to me, it's incomprehensible. And so I am going to share with you a bit about the brain this morning. It's not going to be sort of heavy neuroscience. I'm going to share with you things that I tell older people in older people's workshops, people in their 70s and 80s, things that I do in workshops with what we call NEETs in Northern Ireland, young people not in education, employment or training. They're the bottom of the pile educationally. Things that I'm doing with students as well as staff in Hyde Bank College, things that I do in the in Ulster University when I'm training people there. It's the same kind of material. And often when they've gone through maybe 5 workshops, it takes young people, teenagers who aren't at school, and they've gone through 5 workshops. And I said to them, would you have come to 5 talks by Dr. Kelly on neuroscience and learning? And they said, oh, no way, And I said, well, you've just done it. That's what you've done in the past 5 weeks. And yet you think that you're stupid and that you can't get through the education system. So I'm hoping that it'll be interesting to you. I hope it will be something that will begin to stimulate your interest in the brain, and certainly I believe it's something that is not a luxury, it's a necessity for all teachers. As I said earlier, I was a general practitioner. I didn't specialize in any particular area of the body, but I knew a lot about the human body and about health and well-being. And I view people like yourselves, people who are involved in any kind of training or mentoring, and not only that, even parents, youth workers, as learning practitioners. Because when you think, what is the organ of the body I am trying to influence, change, develop? It's got to be the brain. And so you would expect that learning practitioners would have at least a working knowledge of how that organ functions. When I was graduated in medicine, I I'd studied tomes and tomes of material for 6 years for the final exams. And when I went into the ward for the first day as a houseman, I had a little book about that size that was in my pocket. That was really about all I needed to function practically on a day-by-day basis in the ward and look after most of the patients. Now, of course, I had to draw on other things as well, but this was my handbook. This was my manual that got me through the week. And that's what I've tried to do really in the book on teaching and learning, on whole brain learning. I've tried to reduce a lot of the stuff about learning and learning styles in the brain. I've tried to reduce it down to something that's like a practical manual that parents could use, that learners could use, that students could use. Because those students are actually themselves becoming learning practitioners. In other words, they're being given material that they're supposed to learn. And it's a real conviction of mine that if they themselves understand how their own brains learn, they will learn much more effectively and actually probably enjoy it a lot more. And so Fingerprint Learning is now a bit of a mission really to try and get whole brain learning down at an accessible level to not only to people who are teaching in university, but to the students themselves, and to understand how the brain works. One of the reasons why I'm so convinced about this is that 90% of our knowledge about the brain has been discovered in the last 25 or 26 years. Now, the reason for that is that in the 1990s, drug companies began to pour vast amounts of money into research on the brain for diseases such as strokes and Alzheimer's and so on. And that coincided with the development of brain scanners. Up until that time, most of the research on the brain was done on dead brains, diseased brains, or damaged brains. Now we could see inside a living brain while we were experimenting, and there was an explosion of medical knowledge about how the brain functions. But what wasn't quite anticipated was that there was also an explosion of understanding about how the brain learns, and that the brain is the organ of learning and how it goes about learning. And I'd like to put to you this morning, what impact should that have had on teaching and training in any area of learning? If 90% of what we know has been discovered in that time, I want to suggest it should have been a revolutionary change. This is an example of what scanners can do. Some of you will be much more expert at this than I am, but for instance, when we're reading words, you're using the occipital lobe. Here, you're hearing words, you're using the temporal lobe. You're speaking words, you're using the parietal lobe. And here, you're thinking about words, that's the frontal lobe. This is one of the wonders of what scanning has been able to do for us. We can see what's going on in different parts of the brain as it's working. 25 years ago, we didn't have mobile phones. And it has revolutionized all of our lives, not only adults, but even children. It's hard to imagine life without a mobile phone now. If you meet someone who doesn't have a mobile phone, it's a bit like a dinosaur at the minute. That has revolutionized our lives. 25 years ago, we didn't have email. It has revolutionized our communication. 25 years ago, we didn't have Google. You couldn't say, well, I'll Google it. Whereas everybody says that they can do that now. The digital revolution has revolutionized the way we communicate. Now, what I'm suggesting to you, 90% of what we know about the brain has been discovered in that period of time. We should be in a learning revolution. We should be finding that we're in a revolution, like the digital revolution, that we can hardly keep up with the changes. I have a mobile phone that I can't even use 90% of the things that it is able to do, and there are still more models coming out. This digital revolution is going on and on and on, and we should be in a teaching and learning revolution that we are struggling to keep up with. And yet I know if I went back to the school that I was educated in 50 years ago, grammar school, I would not get the feeling that a revolution was taking place. I wouldn't get the feeling that the teachers are excited and enthusiastic and are struggling to keep up with all that we have discovered about learning and teaching. And again, it's a wee bit like the king's new clothes. Why is that the case? And of course, it comes back again to if teacher training students are not even being taught about the brain. For instance, we could say, well, yes, 50 years ago, maybe you can understand why there aren't lectures on the brain, why they aren't being taught about it, because we didn't know that much about it. Now 90% of what we know about it has been discovered. This does not make sense anymore. And so I suppose I'm hopefully trying to persuade you this morning that understanding how the brain learns has begun a revolution that many educational establishments haven't yet really begun to participate in. And in listening to what's being said this morning about pushing ahead and the ways that students want to learn, for instance, and making this organization really up to speed with where things are going, that's very exciting. And perhaps you may have more flexibility about doing that than other institutions have. The eye, now this is not a trick question, okay, a trick quiz. The eye does what? Thank you, okay. The ear, the stomach, digests, so very good. And the brain, there are various options, of course. You could say processes or things, but the word I'm looking for is the brain learns. When you are working as a tutor with a student, what I'm trying to persuade you is that you have to be thinking, I am working with the brain of this person. And the better I understand the way their brain works, the more able I will be to make them more successful. If you were a doctor and you were working with someone's hand, and knowing about how that hand works would be a great help in helping them use it more effectively and helping them on to healing. I'm going to suggest there are at least 3 areas of the brain that are important in terms of teaching and learning, and we're not going to cover all this morning. I'm just really introducing this to you. The prefrontal cortex, that's known as the executive center. It's where we make decisions and plan and think ahead. The amygdala and the brainstem, that is your fight and flight response and so on. And then we have the cerebral hemispheres. And I'm going to finish this morning's session talking a wee bit about the right and left hemispheres and learning. I want to ask a question here, which is, what is education? And you could probably give various answers to this, but I want to suggest to you that education is transmitting information, or transmitting and receiving information. A specialist in the brain has called information the unit of exchange in the brain. I have information in my brain this morning on teaching and learning in the brain, and I want to transmit some of that information to you. John earlier on was trying to transmit information to you about developments within the Open University. You as tutors are seeking to transmit information to your students. So I want to suggest that that's a fair enough description of education, the transmission of information. One of the first statements I would like to sort of leave in your mind today when you go from here is that all learning is making connections between information. When my grandson was born, from the moment he was born, he was hearing sounds being spoken all around him, and one of those sounds was an ah sound. And that ah sound went into his brain and became lodged in his brain as a sound. Later on, somebody is going to show him that that ah sound is linked with a particular symbol, which is the symbol in the center there. It's not linked with an O or an E. It's linked with that particular symbol, and they will link the information about the sound that was there to new information about the symbol that represents it. And later on, someone will then link that to another bit of information, which is how he can actually draw that himself. So there will be 3 pieces of information that will become linked together to build a network. And of course, then he can go on to increase that network by adding other bits of information to it. And so here we have little units or networks of information all being joined up together to build greater networks of information. And I want to suggest to you that that is all that learning involves. If you've got that, you've got what learning's about. So for instance, today, I will be trying to help you link information in your brain so you will go away knowing some of the things that I already know about the brain and learning. When you're working with your students, You have already linked together information in your area of expertise, and you want to help them make the same links in their brains that you have made in yours, and then they will do a test or an examination that will show whether in fact they've actually made those links. Now, there are three possibilities here. One is that sometimes the person you're working with has not made the links, and it's because either they didn't have the information beforehand, so they couldn't make it, or it's that they had the information, nobody had ever linked it together. Have you ever had that experience where you knew the thing, but you had that aha moment where suddenly you realized what it really meant? And so sometimes working with people, they haven't got the information or they haven't linked it. And of course, this is a very important part of teaching and learning. If I was working with teachers, I would be explaining to them at this point how important it is within the classroom environment to have as non-threatening an environment as possible. Because a lot of learning is learning to volunteer your ignorance. Going to school is a very stressful thing for children, because every day they go, they're being asked to volunteer their ignorance, what they don't know. I had a group of teachers in a school in Belfast last year, and about 40 teachers, and I began to ask them questions about what we've been doing. And you would think, being teachers, of course, what would teachers like when they ask questions? All the class to put their hand up? So I had a group of teachers, and I thought, of course, they'll all put their hands up. How many hands went up? Maybe 4 or 5, because none of us like to volunteer our ignorance. Now, if you're in that situation every single day, that can be quite stressful, and we expect children to do that, either by being asked a question, or if they volunteer putting up their hands, they could be right or they could be wrong. And yet it's so important that they can do that, because otherwise we don't know if they have made the links or not made the links. It's the only way we can find out if the information was there or not there. If you think of the number of people coming from other cultures into Ireland or England, for instance, who obviously have not made links that we have made growing up, for instance, a lot of work can be helping them to give them information that they never had before, or to link information in a different way in their brains. So creating a situation where it's possible for people to volunteer their ignorance and not be embarrassed about it, or frightened about it, or scared about it, or feel stupid about it is very important in teaching and learning. In one of the workshops that I was doing in an estate, I do quite a bit of workshops with mothers who left school early, perhaps they got pregnant or something, didn't complete their GCSEs, and then just left education and feel that they're stupid and have no incentive really to go on. And in the workshops, we try to turn them around and get them re-engaged with education. And one of the mothers was saying to me that in her daughter's primary school, the previous week, the child had put their hand up to ask a question, and the teacher said, "Put your hand down. I'm here to teach you, not answer your questions." Can you imagine that? I mean, and that's within recent history. That teacher has missed a wonderful teaching opportunity, haven't they? Because when the child puts their hand up, they're saying, "I haven't made the connections that you have made. Please help me make that connection." Well, that child will probably never raise their hand again in that teacher's class, because they will be so scared of being put down like that. And a teaching opportunity will have been missed. Sometimes people have made the wrong connections. If a child going to school for the first time had only ever seen a saw for cutting wood, and the teacher talks about a seesaw, that child's thinking this has something to do with cutting wood, because they have made the wrong connection, and they haven't had a chance to know what a seesaw really is. When I was about 18, I'd qualified to go in and do medicine in Queen's, so I wasn't thick, despite what you might think today. And I've been raised in Canada, and in Canada I have a vivid memory as a boy about competitions in the back of cereal packets. And there'd be first, second, third prize, and the third prize was a consolation prize. And the consolation prize was often bookends. Now, I don't know why this is stuck in my mind, but I thought bookends were the last 3 or 4 pages of about 20 books. They sent them to you. The one you liked, you said, "I would like that book," and they sent you that book as your consolation prize. So at 18 years old, about to go to university, I'm sitting in somebody's house, and they're talking about their bookends. And I'm thinking, no, those aren't bookends. Bookends are the last few pages of something you get in a consolation prize. Now, I wasn't stupid, but I had made a wrong connection. But somehow for 18 years, I had managed to go through life, and that wrong connection had never come out in order to make the right connection. And again, in teaching and learning, this is so important that the students have a chance and feel the freedom to be able to volunteer something that may be a wrong connection, because when you know what the wrong connection is, you can actually make the correct one. And a lot of people studying in various areas of life actually do go through life with wrong connections, that not because they're stupid, they never had the chance to actually have that wrong connection corrected. Sometimes it's not wrong connections, but it's different connections. If a young child goes to school and the teacher says, now we're going to talk about takeaway today, and the only takeaway they know is a Chinese or a chippy or something like that, they're immediately making the connection with food. It's not a wrong connection, it's a different connection. When I was young, the transfer test was called a verbal reasoning test. And often in the test you would have a proverb to fill in the missing word. And a good friend of mine, when he came to the transfer test, had this proverb: where there's a will, there's a... No, that's your answer. He had never, ever heard that before. And so what he wrote was, where there's a will, there's a dead man. Now, I've had other offerings than that. Where there's a will, there's a lawyer. Or where there's a will, there's relatives. It wasn't a wrong connection. It was a different connection. A teacher would have been, I think, quite wrong to put him down for that. But wants to redirect him towards another connection, which is the one he'll get the mark for in the exam. But actually, I thought it was a really good suggestion. And so sometimes, as we're going through these, we have no connections are there. You've discovered that, and you think, okay, I need to put that information in, or I need to help them link up this information they never linked. Or they've made a wrong connection, and I need to help them correct that wrong connection. Or it's a different connection, and I need to encourage them for that, but I also need to redirect them towards what the right connection could be. And of course, that's part of the skill of a learning practitioner. Being a learning practitioner is being able to recognize these students are making connections in totally different areas compared to what I want them to make connections in. Now, part of my skill as a practitioner is to engage them now in what I'm interested in. Got a couple of just short video clips here to illustrate what I've been saying. You may have seen these. This first one is what I would call an example of a wrong connection. Now, it's all in German, but don't worry about it. Even if you don't know any German, you should get the point of it.
Das hier ist mein Sektor. Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät. Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
The next one you might also have seen, but I see this as not a wrong connection, but a different connection. This again is in German, and the daughter has given her father an iPad as a gift and wants to know how he's getting on.
Sag mal, Papa, habe ich dich noch gar nicht gefragt. Wie kommst du eigentlich mit dem neuen iPad zurecht, was wir dir zum Geburtstag geschenkt haben?
Gut.
Mit den ganzen Apps kommst du klar?
I must have had a sort of an epiphany when I was 18 about Proverbs. Again, just about the same age. Up to that time, I thought the proverb, many hands make light work, meant that someone in Lancashire had used their hands to mine the coal. Someone had used their hands to put it on the boat to bring it to Ballylumford. Somebody's hands had turned that coal into electrical power. Someone's hands had wired that to a power station and then wired it to my house. So when I switched on the light, many hands had made that light work. I hope you get that. I like to think that was a different connection. Maybe it was a wrong connection. I think that was quite ingenious, actually. The point I'm making is this: it wasn't until I was 18 I discovered what that proverb really meant. And I wasn't stupid. And so what I'm really trying to say is, in the area of education, when we understand that education is helping people to make the links between information that you have made, there's often a process in that of discovering where they didn't make the links, where they made wrong links, or where they've made different links that are absolutely critical to the process of them going on to learn. Teaching is enabling the learner's mind to make the connections the teacher has already made. And the skill of learning practitioners is knowing how to do that with different kinds of students. So, my first statement I wanted to really get across this morning is that all learning is about making connections. I hope I've persuaded you about that this morning if you weren't already. What I want to go on to say is that the brain is actually wired to make connections through 86 billion cells or neurons. That's the cover of the book that I decided on because it illustrates the making of connections in the brain. And the colours are intended to I'm trying to tell you the connections I made when I chose that. The connections I'm trying to make are that it's exciting, it's wonderful. Learning, making connections is a wonderful experience. And as practitioners, to help somebody else make those connections, there could be no greater vocation or calling than that. Now, if you are familiar with Spanish in Spain, you can't answer this question. But for instance, I was in Spain last year. I don't know anything about Spanish. And I saw this and I thought, what is that? Can you even tell me what they think that is? And no Spanish speakers are allowed here. Why do you say it's a pharmacy? It sounds like it, yes, and it looks like it. You see, the information about a pharmacy that we have in our heads already, although you spell it differently, is very similar. So it's easy to make that link between the new information and the information that you already had. And of course, it looks like one. What about that one? A bank. Why would you say a bank? Cash machine? Anything else? The words, yes, okay. Maybe the euro sign, for instance. And again, you're looking at how to link new information, which is what this building is, with information that's already in your brain. The cash machine's interesting. In the European Football Championships in Germany some years ago, the German people were really confused by the British fans because they would come up to them and say, "Where's the nearest hole in the wall?" And they thought, why would you be looking for a hole in the wall? It didn't connect with information that the German people had in their minds about these. This again was in Spain, and again, as long as you don't know Spanish, what do you think that says? Okay, it's got to be one of two things. So if I show you this one, why do you say entrance? Because you know it's similar to our word entrance, so you can make that link quite easily. This was a harder link to make. You knew it's either entry or exit. Now you know the first one. Now you can link this together. What I didn't understand is, when these were in Spanish, why was this in English? When you get a box of chocolates and you go for the nice square one, what should it always be when you put your teeth into it? Of course, firm, toffee, something like that. That's the connection I make. If I pick it up and it's strawberry cream or orange cream, I think this is criminal. There should be a law that says it must always be firm and toffee, because that's the connection that I have made in my brain. Teaching takes place in the classroom. Learning takes place in the brain. Of course, it takes place in the brain. So I could teach here all day on a subject, and no learning might take place. It's what's happening in the brain of the student that determines if there's learning taking place or not. So I want to look at how learning takes place in the brain. This is one of those 86 billion neurons. What I'm going to do now is very diagrammatic and simplified, but hopefully it'll get a message across. And it is a part of a network of neurons. Here are 2 neurons that are feeding information into it. There are thousands of others feeding into that one cell. And I've got 3 in which it is feeding information into. There are up to 10,000 others that it is passing information into, and they in turn are feeding to others. Can you see the similarity between that and the diagram and the information circles? Because the brain is actually structured to make connections between information. This is what I call the mighty neuron, and I've picked out one of these. And these blue arrows represent impulses coming into other neurons from outside, tiny electrical impulses, stimulating this so that it sends an impulse along the long branch or axon to other smaller branches that then transmit that out to these small branches or dendrites of other nerves. That's all that learning is. When someone's learning something new for the first time, these are being activated. Neurons are active that were not activated before. When a child is born, they're born with all of these neurons, but they haven't been activated. And suddenly, light, sound, temperature, so on, there's massive stimulation going into that child's brain. And it's like a firestorm going off within the brain as these neurons become activated and electrical signals start to travel through it. And its early days and experiences have this massive interconnection going on within the brain. When you learn something new for the first time, you are using some of these neurons that you had never used before. And so you begin to activate them, and electrical stimulation begins to pass along it, carrying information. And as you repeat that, a layer of fat gets laid down along the long branch. It's called myelin. And it insulates this long branch from the others that are closely packed around it, so that this signal can travel at up to 200 miles an hour. That's why when you're first learning something new, you're slow and deliberate at it. But gradually, as you practice it, repeat it, and overlearn it, this gets laid down and it becomes much, much faster. It's interesting watching young people often with their mobile phones. Sometimes it's like an extension of their hand. They're so fast. And then they get a new one. They're not quite so fast at that because they're having to use neurons they didn't have to use for the previous phone. But as they get those activated and use it, then they become just as fast. So this is all that learning is about. It is activating neurons in your students' brains that were never activated before to help them build more networks of information in their brains. Now, this is something that we really didn't know 20 or 25 years ago. I just want you to watch what happens here. As these neurons are stimulated, they grow more branches. Technically, we say they grow more synapses. That's where nerves join together, but let's just call it branches for the minute. When I graduated medicine, we were taught then, a long time ago now, we were taught then your brain sort of hit a peak at 20 and then just gradually declined after that, rather depressing. What we know now is the brain is what we call a plastic organ. It's not fixed, it keeps developing. And from the earliest stages of life, it prunes branches you're not using and it develops branches that you are using. And the opposite is true as well. Lack of stimulation of these neurons, you lose the branches that you already had. I'm sure you've seen pictures of children when they went into Romania and behind the Iron Curtain, of children that had had no stimulation in orphanages, sitting just on the sides of beds, rocking like that. because their brains had not developed these normal branches in childhood. There are certain points in a child's development, for instance, that are particularly suitable to the development of branches in the brain. For instance, certain children go through a certain phase in their childhood when suddenly their vocabulary expands dramatically, and the brain seems to be susceptible to growing these branches and neurons to do with vocabulary. If they miss that opportunity, it is much more difficult later for them to build that vocabulary. It takes much more effort. That's also the time when it's ideal to learn a new language, because the brain is susceptible to that at the time. When I'm talking with people in their 50s and 60s, I don't think there's anybody that age here, I'm saying to them, the interesting thing is that when people, you see, when you're at school and you're young, lots of new learning, and your brain is being stimulated a lot to keep growing branches. Then you get into your working life, and most new learning has to do with your job or a hobby. The amount of new learning drops dramatically. And what happens in retirement? How much new learning do people do? Very, very little. And so people are losing tens of thousands of branches throughout their retirement, if you want. And then we say, oh, well, mental decline's inevitable. I've worked with hundreds of people through the BrainFit program in the last number of years. I haven't met one person over 65 who did not think mental decline is inevitable. And as they lose their memory or their mind fails a bit, they just think, well, that's part of aging. It is not part of aging. It is part of not stimulating our brains through new learning. And that's why I think that Open University has such a tremendous opportunity, if you want me, not only to help people's education, actually to help the mental well-being of our whole population. If we can get people re-engaging again at any level in learning, we can cause not this to happen, but we can be causing this to happen. So learning is making connections between units of information. We said the brain is wired to make connections. I hope you're with me on that now. Through all of these cells. And now we're moving on to the area of really learning styles. We know every brain is wired to learn, but not every brain is wired in the same way. The individual wiring of the brain has been called the grain of the brain. If this remote was a plane, like not an aeroplane, but a wood plane, all right, and this was a piece of wood, and I took the plane and I plane this wood with the grain, I get a nice smooth action and a nice result. The same plane, just as good a plane, and I plane against the grain, I get, it's difficult, it's rough, and the more I force it, the less liable it is actually to turn out the way I want it to turn out. Now, if we imagine that in here we all are wired to learn, but we are wired in different ways, and you imagine that the way you're wired is like a piece of wood. Sorry, don't be insulted by that, okay? If I teach you with the grain of your brain, you will always learn. It's what the brain does. If you put food in the stomach, you don't have to train the stomach to digest it. It's what the stomach does. The brain learns. If you are taught with the grain of your brain, it will always learn. But if you are taught against the grain of your brain, learning will be difficult, perhaps unsuccessful, and the problem is you will end up thinking, my brain's the problem. When I'm working with teachers, I give an example of saying, if you had a classroom with children and you asked them all to wear size 5 shoes all day, playground, going up and down stairs and so on, the children who had size 5 feet would be fine. Children with 4.5 or 5.5 would struggle, but they might manage. Children who had size 6 or size 4 really wouldn't be able to do it, but they'd think their feet were the problem, not the shoes. One of the great difficulties is that we tend to have an education system in this part of the world that is what we call one size fits all. We'll teach everyone the same. We'll make it fair, all right, by teaching everyone the same way, and we will assess everyone in the same way. And that will be fair. But one size doesn't fit all. And so we are very adept at teaching with the grain of certain kinds of brains, but that is actually teaching against the grain of other kinds of brains. And so we have very good successes in education, and we have very high percentages of what you'd call failures in education. The big challenge is this, as I understand it, is those for whom the system worked are the ones who are determining and deciding what everybody's going to learn and how they're going to learn it. You with me? It worked for them. And the ones for whom it didn't work, like they just couldn't be bothered. Or we need the people for whom it didn't work contributing to how we should be teaching if we want to see a change taking place. And that's where we come on to this phrase of learning styles or learning preferences. Neither of those are phrases that I like for various reasons, but they're out there in common language, and so we tend to have to use them. But somebody's learning style is a window into what is the grain of their brain. When they know the grain of their brain, they can work out how they learn best. And when the teacher knows the grain of their brain, they can work how best to teach that student. This is a fuller quotation from Roger Sperry that I mentioned earlier. The more we learn and the more we recognize the unique complexity of any one human intellect, the stronger the conclusion becomes that the individuality inherent in our brain networks makes that of fingerprints or facial features gross and simple by comparison. That's 1981. So why are we still teaching children all the same way and assessing them all the same way so many years later on? This is, I know that the term learning cycle is used in different ways. This is the way I use it. Here is what you want a student to learn, or what you want to learn, maybe behavior skills or something like that. And over here is success, where they have managed to get through that learning process and they've achieved. And of course, it's very rewarding when you get to success. You want to learn more. No one goes from here to here in one step, one lecture, or something like that. We all go through what I call a learning cycle. Whether we complete the cycle or at what speed we go through it all depends on whether we are being taught with the grain or against the grain. If you're taught with the grain, you will have no difficulty in getting through to success. But if you are taught against the grain of your brain, you will get stuck somewhere on that circle. The teacher then moves on. You don't get through the next one, the teacher moves on, and you become accustomed never to complete a learning cycle. And I work, and when you work in the prisons, or you work with some of the NEETs, young people who haven't achieved in school, you're dealing with young people who through their whole lives have never completed a learning cycle. So why would they want to engage with education? Because it's just a story of failure for them. Whereas if they had been taught with the grain of their brain, they would have experienced success. And once we start to take them through some of the programs and the workshops, and they are given what I've just given you, but the brain and neurons and all of that I've just said, they are given that, but they're given it in ways that reach different grains of the brain. They have no difficulty understanding it and applying it to themselves. Just nobody has bothered to work out, well, what is the grain of your brain? And they end up feeling they are stupid. So this is where we come to the whole area, as I said, of learning styles. And I deal with this in the book, but in the second session I'm taking today, I'll take up a couple of these. There are memories, 5 memories we have. It's good to know which memory are you teaching to when you're teaching. Which of the 5 are you aiming for? Sensory preferences, that's usually known as VAK. I call it VATK. Multiple intelligences. Right and left hemisphere, which we're going to go on to for a few minutes now. The role of emotions and threat, and finally the 4 different working styles. These all are ways of windows into what is the grain of the student's brain, how can I help them to learn with the grain, which all of these contribute to. And of course, most important of all is knowing What is the grain of your brain? What's the grain of the teacher's brain? Because you bring that to the teaching process. Many teachers tend to assume that their students learn the way that they learn. And of course, that's not the case. And so it's very helpful when you know what the grain of your brain is to realize, well, there are students here for whom this will be wonderful. I'll automatically be going with the grain of their brain, but there will be students I'm working with, and the grain of my brain may be quite opposite to the grain of their brain. And so how can I adapt the way I deliver the teaching or help them engage with the teaching in a way that will go with the grain of their brain? One of the great things about what I certainly feel the Open University offers is for students for whom they were taught against the grain of their brain in primary, secondary education and then disengaged with education for that reason, and then later on begin to develop a thirst for learning, can often through what you're providing find access to learning that they've been switched off before and re-engaged with it again. And that's a tremendous thing to be able to do for somebody who had punched out of learning some time before. I'm going to move on and talk a wee bit about one example of the grain of the brain. And it's the whole area of right and left hemisphere learning. And where I have found certainly that teachers have been taught about learning styles, it's usually VAK or multiple intelligences. Very rarely are they taught about this, and yet this is so fundamental to teaching and learning. This is a scan of the right and left hemispheres, and this is a sort of caricature of what the right and left hemisphere are like, and represents some of the sort of mythology about it that's talked about out in society that actually gives the right and left hemisphere thinking a bad name. This is another example. Sorry, the slide's a bit blurred, but they've got love and music and creativity on the right side, and sort of other, and obviously more boring because it's not colourful, reason, strategy on the left side. That's what gives right and left hemisphere thinking a bad name, and so I sort of want to get that out there because sometimes people then dismiss it for that reason. So, sorry to be technical here, but we have a right and a left hemisphere, if that's making a connection for you. And they are separated by a gap in between. This became very vivid to me when I was a medical student. We had a professor of surgery who'd worked in Nigeria, and he showed us a slide one day of an x-ray of a man who had walked to his clinic about 20 miles with a nail hammered into his head. He had offended the chief of the tribe, and his punishment was to have a nail hammered into his head, and it had gone right down between the two hemispheres and had not damaged his brain, which was extraordinary. So that image has stayed with me. Each side is anatomically different and biochemically different. There are a lot of differences between them. Now, I'm going to say something that's a principle, and then I sort of want you to forget it. But for instance, when it comes to movement, the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. If you have a stroke here on the left side, you're paralyzed on the right side. Now, what I just want to get at is use both hands, so you use both hemispheres for movement, but if you're right-handed, the left hemisphere is dominant for movement, and vice versa. So you use them both, but for movement, one is usually dominant over the other. Now, what I'm going to say has nothing to do with you're right or left-handed, okay? So there's not a right-handed dominant learner. Put that to one side. That's just for movement. But the same is true when it comes to the way the brain processes information. And I'll be talking a bit more about this in the seminar later on. The left hemisphere, these are just a few terms I've picked out. The left hemisphere is very much described by focused attention, more narrow attention to detail. The right hemisphere is associated with broad attention. The left hemisphere tends to take in information and then represent it in some kind of accurate theoretical form. The right hemisphere is what we say is more present, it's more aware and responsive to what is there. The left hemisphere, therefore, is concerned about taking in accurate theoretical data because it wants certainty and it wants to arrive at truth in terms of an accurate answer or structure of information. The right hemisphere is more concerned about what's true in terms of it. Will it work? This is the theory, but if it doesn't work, you need to look at the theory again. So this is a very rough, if you want, sort of sketch of differences between the two. So this is what the left hemisphere is good at. Following clear instructions, doing one task at a time before it goes on to another one, being shown how to do something. The left hemisphere likes to know exactly how should I do it and what should it look like when it's been done. It fits in with what's expected. What are the rules? What do people expect of me? And it will be more liable to conform to that. It likes to have more time to think something through before it gives an answer. And it likes to have time to prepare before it's pushed into doing something. It doesn't like to be put on the spot. A person might be a very capable singer or soloist, but if you say, would you sing for us tonight? They'll say, no, I would have needed 2 weeks' notice for that. Okay? That's very much the sort of left hemisphere. Or it likes to consider options before it decides on purchases or making decisions. So, I mean, people will search the internet and various things before they'll actually make a decision. How many of you would say that describes you a lot? Quite a few hands going. Okay, well, we'll look at what it has difficulty with. When it's no clear idea of what is expected, when the instructions are too vague or general, or having to do too many tasks at one time, or when there isn't enough information about how to do something, or when other people don't keep to the rules because you're keeping to the rules, or having to answer without enough time to think, or doing something and being put on the spot when you're not confident, or having to make a decision before you've thought through the options. Now, many of you would still put your hand up for that, okay? So that may indicate that you use your left, everyone uses both sides, but it may indicate that you use your left side of your brain more than perhaps your right, and it tends to be dominant as a thinker. You will find that the left dominant students will love the way you teach, but the right dominant students may be a struggle. Let's look at the right side. It likes the big picture. The left side builds up to the big picture by taking the pieces and putting them together sequentially. The right hemisphere starts with the big picture and then works down. It gets involved in doing more than one task at a time and thinks of different ways of doing things. The left hemisphere tends to look at what is the correct way to do it. The right hemisphere tends to think, but there's other ways of doing this. And so it tends to think of alternatives. It likes to get others to fit in around it. Before I got into this, one of my daughters, when she was a teenager, I remember around the tea table saying to us one day, you know the problem with people? They won't fit in with what I want them to do. That's a classic right dominant statement. Or answering without having to think too long. You're very quick to get in there with your opinion, your thoughts, don't have to reflect on it. Or willing to take a chance and do something new. Or having a gut feeling and going with your impulse and instinct and actually often being right when you do that. How many people have said describes you more than the other one? Okay, right. What it finds difficult, too many instructions and long explanations. The right hemisphere, once it's got the gist of the thing, it stops listening. Have you ever dealt with a right dominant person and you're trying to explain something to them, and once they've got it, you with me, they just stop listening. Or they get bored doing only one thing at a time, or having to follow other people's rules. Other people's rules are their guidelines. The right hemisphere needs to know why it is doing something to get into the left hemisphere. If you're working with a right hemisphere student, you've got to help them see what's the point of this if you want to get them into the how. Or when others don't fit around what you want to do, in fact, it is not conforming. Or when other people want to think things through too long before actually taking action. Now, how many people would still put their hand up for that? Right, okay. Now, very briefly, I was involved in a research project about 7 years ago into entrepreneurs, and in a discussion with a colleague in Stranmillis, we were talking about enterprise and entrepreneurship, and the fact that there are a lot of anecdotal stories about entrepreneurs who didn't do well at school, but became successful later on, so they weren't stupid. And actually, a number of them went on to get quite significant qualifications later on. And we began to wonder, is there a grain to the entrepreneurial brain? Now, the traits of entrepreneurs had been well researched for many years, but what we discovered is no one had actually researched their learning style or learning preferences. And so we took a number of measurements for them, conforming and non-conforming and so on, but one of them we took was right and left hemisphere dominance. Now, because there'd been no research done, we didn't know what the result was going to be until we got it. This was the result. That was astonishing to us. It was so striking. It was telling us that entrepreneurial, the large majority of the entrepreneurs we interviewed, and amongst those were people like Lord Ballyedmond, Sir Peter Fitzgerald, Sir William Hastings, some people in the Invest NI Hall of Fame, for instance, as well as some young entrepreneurs, female and male entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs and commercial entrepreneurs. So there was quite a spectrum, although it was a small-scale study. Now, I want to ask you, when you look at our education system, would you say it's biased towards the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere? I've never had a teacher say anything different. Of course it is. This is the way you learn, this is what you learn, this is the way we'll test you. If that fits the grain of your brain, that's wonderful. The one word we came out for in the study for entrepreneurs is they are non-conforming. So here's an interesting thing. Government rhetoric is telling us that the public sector is shrinking and private enterprise needs to grow to create more jobs and more wealth. Who creates private enterprises? Entrepreneurs. Where are the future entrepreneurs? They're in school. Who are they? They are non-conforming, right-dominant learners. What do we do with the non-conforming learners? We make them conform or we marginalize them. So we have an education system that is mismatched to what we are saying we need socially. We need people who are at school who says, I will work for myself or I will make jobs, and are thinking that from about 11, 12, 13 years onwards to create the jobs for the people who are coming out with the qualifications. And so I've chosen this because this is one very clear and vivid example for me of where, for a learning practitioner, when I'm working with people, I'm thinking, well, what's the grain of my brain? Am I more left or right dominant, or am I sort of go between the two a lot? I need to know that, because if I'm working with a left dominant student, I need to give them the material in this way and help them go with the grain of their logical, systematic, one step at a time, one task at a time processing. But suppose I'm working with a right dominant student. Now that's my challenge as a left dominant teacher. How I adapt my approach to them to a right brain way of thinking, and vice versa. If I am a more right dominant tutor, how can I adapt to a more left dominant student? Now, for me as learning practitioners, I just consider this to be like ABC. This is like fundamental to teaching and learning. I think, why is this not done in teacher training colleges? Why are not all teachers trained to come out and recognize it in themselves and recognize it, and then know how to shape their lessons to cater for both sides? Because until we do this, we're going to find that our future entrepreneurs who drive the wealth that helps to pay for what we're doing are going to be disadvantaged. Many years ago, I still meet people, and you may know them, they were disciplined for using their left hand in school. Do you remember that kind of thing? We would consider that child abuse today. But in terms of right and left hemisphere learning, the same thing is going on in classrooms right throughout our country, every day in this area. So, just to finish off, a bit of fun, see how you can do right. Who is more right and who's more left? Come on, volunteer your ignorance. Go ahead, sir. Who's left? Van Gaal? If you're a Man United fan, you'll understand what's going on when you understand hemisphere differences. Alex Ferguson, definitely more flair, okay, more intuitive, exciting football. The fans are tearing their hair out at the minute because Louis van Gaal has a system he wants to impose on the team and wants the team to play to the system. That's the frustration. Bobby Charlton and George Best. Who is more right? obvious. He could do things nobody else could do. But was he non-conforming? Bobby Charlton, the professional's professional. Who's right? I have no interest in cooking, but I was watching television coming up to Christmas a couple of years ago, and it just flicked on, and Jimmy Oliver was there. His family were there. The TV people were there. The thing was totally chaotic but fascinating. 2 days later, Delia Smith was on, and she was preparing for Christmas dinner. And the first thing she said is, the first thing you do preparing for Christmas dinner is you make a list. And I thought, absolutely. And there will be some people watching who will love Delia, and and Jamie Oliver will do their head in. Now, if you get what we're talking about, you'll understand this. Pope Benedict, left or right? An academic, okay, very left. Pope Francis is doing the Curia's head in. He orders pizzas, he takes taxis. He is non-conforming in a very left-dominant system. And what's going to happen is the Curia will just keep its head down until his time passes, and then we'll go back to business as usual. And just to be up to date with snooker, Ronnie O'Sullivan, absolutely right. Flair player. They always bring out the crowds. The right dominant sports people always bring the crowds out, okay? Mark Selby, and of course, I have to get an Irishman in here. Alex Higgins, totally right. Totally non-conforming. And Steve Davis could bore you to tears, even though he was brilliant. Just as we're coming to an end here, okay, the line between extreme right dominance and ADHD is a very indefinite line. There are a lot of young people who are diagnosed ADHD are extreme right dominant learners. In other words, they do left hemisphere things in right dominant ways. They can't seem to get into their left hemisphere. But because teachers are not taught about hemisphere dominance and don't know how to teach to extreme right dominance, the children are often diagnosed ADHD or labeled ADHD. And the same is true when it comes to the autistic spectrum. A lot of features on the autistic spectrum are features of very left dominant brains. So this is what I want to leave you with, just thinking, how does what I've just shared influence your teaching and learning? Is it something you think about? Is it something you're aware of in the students that you're working with? Is it useful to know about it? I've taken that one last example because part of what I'm trying to say is, as learning practitioners, the information's there for us to take and use, and we have a right to be able to take that and use it. And our students will be more successful if we do. So I started off asking, what is education? And I've just borrowed this quotation here. I love this. It says, education, I think, is where the science of learning meets the art of teaching. Brilliant. I think that's brilliant. And lastly, when we think of re-engaging a population with education, which is what you are about, re-engaging people in our society with learning so they all are increasing feeling, I want to learn, I want to keep my brain active and stimulated. If they use it, they don't have to lose it. Thank you very, very much, and you've been a really cooperative audience. Thank you.